Okay. Oh, that thing's right there. Good. Okay. Thanks for coming. Hi, my name's Rob Moss. I think I know almost everyone here, but I'll do formal introductions. I'm a professor here of geotechnical earthquake and risk engineering in the civil and environmental engineering program. And I'm going to be talking about the recent Turkey earthquakes, which I was doing reconnaissance on. And I'm going to explain what that's about. The association that I work with is called GEER, and I also worked in country with partners at METU University, that's the Middle Eastern Technical University, and that's what that symbol is on your right, is their university symbol in Turkish. And this whole operation is funded by the National Science Foundation and NEHRP, and NEHRP is the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program. So these are federally funded efforts. So a little bit about GEER. GEER is a National Science Foundation organization. It's a nonprofit, and we have a standing budget every year. And what we do is we collect perishable information from extreme events. So we started out as an earthquake organization, but we also do floods and hurricanes and lots of other disasters like that. And when I say perishable, what we're trying to do is we're trying to collect information that usually goes away within about a month when reconstruction starts. And that information is vital for learning what we can about that event so that we can design engineering tools to try to catch it and fix it the next time. I've been involved with this organization since its inception. And my role in this is I'm supposed to get in early. I'm known for somebody that they can send in right after initial recovery is done. So when there's a disaster, you have a couple weeks where there's recovering people that can be recovered. And then there's about a month before reconstruction starts where we can collect that perishable data. So I tend to have the skill set that allows me to get in early, figure out what the big problems are, report back, organize teams, and then disseminate that information. And disseminating is what I'm doing here. I gave an abbreviated version of this talk last week to the Army Corps and FEMA and a bunch of other agencies, PG&E and SoCal Edison. And we had over 400 virtual attendees there. I want to thank you guys for coming out because I'm really tired of giving virtual talks. It's really nice. It's really nice to have people here that I can look at and talk to. So there was 400 people at that meeting, but I didn't see any of them, right? I saw just, it was WebEx, so I saw just like 4 people on the side. And then later they said there was 400 plus at the event. So you guys are the second that will have heard this talk outside of our small group. I give a talk next week to an earthquake engineering institute, and that's going to be virtual and spread broadly. And then a week after that, I give another talk to another virtual group. So the goal is to disseminate this information while we're in the process of collecting more data. I just had a meeting earlier this afternoon where we're figuring out what the next team is that we're going to send in, the next team of experts to collect data, and how we work best with our in-country colleagues. And one of my other skill sets is to define the big picture on stuff. So what you do is you get in country, you drive around, you fly if you can fly, and then you try to assess what is the big picture from this, what can we learn from this, and how do we best execute that. I've done this a bunch. Starting in '99, all over the place, different earthquakes. My specialty is earthquakes. And the last one that I did was in 2015. That was in Nepal. And then things were kind of slow for a while with earthquakes, and then things got COVID-y. And so this is the first COVID event that I have participated in. So I'm going to give you like the full technical, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go through. But here we have plate tectonics, and there's a triple junction that you can see there where the stars are, and the stars are showing the epicenter of some of these events. And so Turkey is really getting squeezed and pinched. And what we have is left lateral motion on these boundaries. And Turkey is a very active tectonic place, just like California, just like Japan, just like other places that are on plate boundaries. This plot shows lots of main events and aftershocks. And what we use this for is getting kind of the spatial coverage of what the rupture in the ground looked like. This rupture occurred roughly 10 kilometers deep, and then the displacement from that rupture. So an earthquake rupture is just displacement at 10 kilometers deep on a large plane, and then those displacements propagate to the ground surface, and that gives us what we call surface fault rupture. Most people think that that's what the fault is, but that's just displacement that happened sympathetically from the rupture at depth. And so here I'm showing there was a precursor event, which was a 6.7. That's the green. And then we had the main event, which is a 7.8. And then 9 hours later, there was a 7.5 on a separate fault. So we go from orange to blue. And then I'm showing some historical seismicity. So you can see that this area is very busy. The fault that's generally more of concern in Turkey is called the Northern Anatolian Fault, and that one runs through Istanbul. And so most people, when they talk about Turkey, they're talking about the Northern Anatolian. This is called the Eastern Anatolian. And this one is more in the breadbasket part and kind of an industrial port part of Turkey, but is, as equally as important. The beach ball that I'm showing there, that's a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional surface that shows the orientation of the fault. And what that tells me is that it was strike slip and that it was left lateral strike slip. So that means that if I'm standing here and the fault's in front of me, the ground was shifting to the left. Contrary to the San Andreas is a right lateral strike slip fault. So the ground's going to shift to the right. This shows a seismologist point of view of the rupture. And I got a pretty good graphic here. Get the graphic to go. This shows an animated sequence of how the ruptures occurred. So it was seismologically, it was actually a pretty complex event. Let's see if we can cycle through that again. The main event actually started on a subsidiary fault that you saw there, and then it propagated both directions on the main Eastern Anatolian Fault. And then 9 hours later, it propagated over onto a separate fault. That's the Sugu-Chamak Fault. And what the people in Turkey experienced was really kind of a 1-2 punch. Main event was at 4 a.m., which is about as bad a time as you can have for an earthquake because everybody's home in bed. The second event happened later in the day and not as much problems because people had got out of their houses due to the ground shaking and they were trying to figure out what was going on. And then if they were near buildings that were going to collapse, they weren't going to have the buildings collapse on them. I want you guys to realize that I'm happy to field any questions as we move along. So I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions right now.
When did the presentation begin? Trying to figure out if I read words.
No, I started at like 6:42. More questions? Yeah.
Was that second quake like all started from the first quake that happened at 4 a.m.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when you have a rupture, it's due to stress that's built up. and you're relieving that stress, but then that shunts the stress to somewhere else. And so showed you the Coulomb stress model after the 7-8, it would show a big red spot where this northern fault is, and then the northern fault ruptured and it shunted stress away. And actually right now to the southern end of this fault is a big red splotch, and it's an area that we're concerned about because it could step over onto what's called the Dead Sea Fault, and then that could rupture through Syria and Lebanon and Israel. And so we're actually trying to mobilize a team right now to go over and investigate that area to see the likelihood of that sequence happening. Turkey is, like Chile, is really well known for these sequence of events. So there's one, and then you're like, well, it looks like that's going to go. And then that one happens, and then you're like, oh boy, here comes another one. California, not so much that way. Why, we don't know, but Turkey is well known for these sequenced events.
How would you measure something that's like likely to become an event?
Yeah, so we do what's called paleoseismology, and so we dig trenches and we look at prior evidence of sequences. And so we dig a trench, and when I say we, I mean my geologist friends that do this, and they would age date displacements and see, does it correlate with a previous event on the main fault, or is it not correlated at all? Yeah, that's the best we can do on forecasting that type of thing. Yep.
How do you get this data?
To do this, so we have, I'm going to show you, this is one of the best instrumented events that we have ever. Turkey has strong ground motion stations all over the place. And so one of the lessons that we're going to get out of this is all these ground motions that we use for forecasting how structures are going to respond. And then you have to do what's called an inversion process. So you take all those motions and you say, what rupture could happen that would give us this data? So you invert it, and then you invert it in such a way that you can do it in a time sequence. So this, I didn't do this. Some very sharp seismologist colleagues did this, and it was a whole team that was working on this. But the data is going to be readily available. The strong motion data is available. Good questions. Yes.
Does Turkey have any early warning system?
Turkey does not. No. Mexico, Japan, Chile has one. The US has been trying to do it for years and kind of, but no, Turkey does not have an early warning system. The early warning system is you would pick up the advanced waves, and sometimes that would give you anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds to prepare for the earthquake. So it's not like, hey, get out of Dodge. It's like, get under the table and hold on.
Did you yourself build Turkey, and if so, in which region?
I'm going to show you that.
Because I actually have some family in the Shanghai region that was directly affected.
Okay, good. Maybe you can show me on the map. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. Okay, excellent questions. Okay, so here is a pre-existing fault map of the area. And again, we had this little rupture that started things. It propagated onto the Eastern Anatolian. That was a bilateral event. And that's important because when you have directivity, when you have a fault rupturing from one end to the other, what it tends to do is it tends to compress the energy. It's like when a train's coming at you, and it's like a Doppler effect. You hear the train coming and the waves get compressed and the frequency gets higher. Earthquake waves do that too. And what we see is that there was a lot of directivity to the south. And if you saw the news about the region of Hatay and the town of Antakya, which really got hammered, it's because it's right in the direction where the fault was propagating. And then we had the northern fault there that ruptured, and it was a bilateral rupture as well, starting in the middle and rupturing out in both directions. Couple more of these sciencey things. Here, this has terrain shown on it. And you can see that the fault sits in a valley. Well, we should say that the valley's there because of the fault. The fault chews up material, water drains and removes that material, so you get a river valley. And then people say, hey, where do I want to live and grow my crops? In the river valley. So we see that all the towns are in the river valley right along the fault, which resulted in lots and lots of damage. Here, I'm showing relative displacements. So we're seeing about, and this is from satellite images, we're seeing about 4 meters of fault offset, of tectonic shift. And this is from the satellite images. On the ground, we actually saw almost 8 meters of left lateral strike slip, particularly on the northern fault. So quite a bit of displacement. And this plot, I want you to look at here. Every red dot is a strong motion instrument that Turkey has where we recorded these ground motions. And you can see that they're particularly clustered around the Eastern Anatolian Fault because they knew the fault was there and we wanted lots of ground motions. So again, this is going to be one of the best instrumented earthquakes. There's going to be a wealth of data that comes out of this. And we use that data to forecast future events. So let's say we're designing a structure and it's a couple kilometers off the fault and it's a strike slip fault and it's a magnitude this. We could go to this database and pull that, and we could model our structure and say, hey, look how it does with these ground motions. Okay, before I get into some images, to give you some place names here, Golbashi is a town that was just north of the epicenter, and there was lots of fault rupture and liquefaction there, and probably 60% of the structures were damaged. Marash, which is a town that you probably saw in the news a lot, where they were doing lots of rescue and recovery, was just south of the epicenter of the main event. Harzacik is just south of the epicenter, and it was near where the little fault and the big fault meet. Elbistan's way up in the north. We're going from sea level all the way up to the Taurus, top of the Taurus Mountains. And so we were in Mediterranean climate, and then we were up in snow country. Very dramatic topography. Iskenderun is in the port area, lots of port facilities there. Antakya, which is the ancient city of Antioch, is in the Hatay region, and that was in the south where the directivity was focused. And then Antep was a place where it was damaged but functional, and that's where we based all of our ground reconnaissance out of. And so I was part of the advanced team. It was me and another colleague, and then we had 2 colleagues in Turkey that we partnered with, and we could not get in the air because the military had a no-fly zone over the whole damage area. And so we were on the ground, driving like crazy, sun up to sundown, documenting as much information as we could. Fortunately, we had good weather. Sometimes you have to battle the weather. And so with that, we had 6 days on the ground. We covered north to south, east to west. And then at that time, we were organizing the second team that came in. The second team came in right as we left, and they were there also for 10 days. And then they just returned, and we're mobilizing a third team right now. Okay, a couple more images for those of you in the earthquake engineering community. Here's some examples of the ground motions. On the squiggles that I show on the left shows an acceleration time history. And generally we had ground shaking on the order of half a G up to 1 G in some locations. Some recordings were greater than a G vertical, which means that that was throwing stuff in the air. We had evidence of boulders that were tossed in the air and then cracked when they landed. So the ground shaking was pretty intense. The plots that I'm showing period versus spectral acceleration, that's with respect to the design codes that we use. And we can see here that in the longer periods, I'm showing the 1 second period. So that would be what a 10-story building would feel. We're seeing spectral accelerations greater than a G, sometimes 2 Gs. So the demand, what we call demand, was pretty high here. That's part of the story, but there's a whole other part of the story. Here, I'm going to show you a lot of pretty rough images in terms of the structural response. On the right, every town has minarets, and it was a pretty good indicator when you pull into town if the minarets were chopped off, that the ground shaking was pretty intense. On the left here, we had both foundation failure and soft story failure. Soft story, think of a 5 or 6 story building where the first story they have open for storefronts. And so they don't have as many shear walls, they don't have as many columns, and those buildings are notorious for collapsing. Lots of soft story building failure here. On the left is in the Hatay region, that's on Turkiye. About 85% of the building stock is gone there. On the right is typical, where you can see highly varied damage. So you see a completely collapsed building. You see a building that had some foundation failure. You see another building that had a soft story collapse, and then you see buildings in the back that are fine. This was pretty typical of what we witnessed in, we're talking about maybe 10 or 12 towns. So it was really intense. And this is what it's like. Notice that there's buildings that are fine, and then there's buildings that you can't even tell is a building. It's just a pile of rubble. I'm gonna get to that. Yep, I'm with you. So this is pretty rough. It got to the point where when we would pull in the towns, it was hard to witness this. So we can't do anything for the people at the moment. What we're trying to do is we're trying to help Turkey prepare for the next event. And then we take all this information out to the scientific community and we say, hey, here's how you're not supposed to do things. No, I mean, what you want at a minimum is you want life safety. So you can see this building here, it's got brick infill. Probably most of the people survived in that structure. That's the minimum that we want out of our structural designers. We want life safety. When we talk about our old buildings in downtown San Luis Obispo that have been retrofitted, they've been retrofitted for life safety. They're not necessarily going to be usable after the earthquake, but everybody's going to be able to survive. So we want life safety, and you can see that structure on the right there, life safety. The structure on the left, no, everyone's dead. This is a tent village here that people are living in, the survivors are living in. And, you know, this was 2-3 weeks after the event. Almost all the structures are reinforced concrete. Not enough reinforcement, poor design. Turkey has really good building codes. Just like we have good building codes, just like Japan has good building codes, just like Nepal has good building codes. What's the problem?
Corruption.
They don't enforce the building codes. There's corruption and there's graft, and it's just heartbreaking to see this. We'll talk about path forward on this. Let's not watch that video again. So, I mean, here you see just outright destruction and then buildings that survived, right? So there are buildings that were designed and they survived these really strong ground motions. So people say, oh, the ground shaking was really hard. It was hard, but no, there's plenty of structures that survive. Some other observations, my group is looking at not structures. We had another group with us from EERI, which is called the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. They focused on structures. We focused on liquefaction, fault rupture, landslides, what else? Rockfall, damage in terms of how foundations affected the buildings, how dams were damaged, how pipelines and highways and other lifelines, we call those lifelines, how those were damaged. So we focus on that aspect of things. And so here I'm showing fault rupture. You can see the spaghetti noodle railroad tracks. That's a cool picture, right? You can see it furrowing through these fields. Here it's going through a field and then through the structure, and it creates these sag ponds. So it's pulled apart and you get these sag ponds. This whole town of Kobayashi, it's a lake town because the fault steps over and creates this sagged area that creates the lake. Offset fence posts, which give us really good markers on how much displacement. Rupturing, taking the heads off hills, rupturing through fields, rupturing through towns. There was fault rupture everywhere. I've never seen fault rupture like this. It was just like every textbook example of fault rupture, it was there. And we had two geologists with us, and that was their job, was to map all of this fault rupture. Liquefaction is where, yeah.
Do you think that you saw so much fault rupture because of the depth of the quake itself, or because of superficial material?
Because it's shallow, and also because strike slip tends to give you surface fault rupture. Strike slip, it happens, and it's just surface fault rupture everywhere. Our local event, the big one, would be a repeat of the Fort Tejon event, which was 1856. And even today, you can see evidence of surface fault rupture still present when you go out to the Carrizo Plain. So strike slip just likes to give you really nice surface fault rupture. Yep.
If where it ruptures or it doesn't at the surface, is that going to affect how much damage is seen in the community equation, even if it's the same magnitude of quake?
When we talk about reverse events, if it ruptures to the ground surface or not can have an impact on how strong the ground shaking is. Here with strike slip, not so much. That mechanism, generally it always ruptures to the ground surface, and it's independent of the ground shaking. It's a good question. Okay, so liquefaction is when you have sandy soils that are saturated and loose, and the earthquake hits it and it liquefies. So you have ground that's firm, and then the earthquake says, no, it's not, it's a fluid. And so anytime that you apply a load to that fluid, things fall down. So here, I would hire that structural engineer any day, right? Look at that. Their building fell over and it's 45 degrees, and you can open those windows and those doors, but they didn't do any foundation at all. Did they not even check? So along with not enforcing the structural building codes, they don't enforce the geotechnical building codes. And there's lots of evidence that people just make up the boring logs underneath the buildings. So there's entire companies that just will fabricate a boring log for you, and then you submit it. So I don't know for a fact if that was done here, but they didn't do anything. They did no geotechnical analysis. On the right, there's that's a port facility, and all the sand that you see there fluidized and then came out of that crack between the two slabs. And they had on the order of about 1/4 meter of displacement, and their cranes, they had to shut down all their cranes while they realign the cranes and adjust the foundations for the cranes. So they're at a shutdown right now. Other port facilities, this wharf here was pile supported. It did great. The material next to it was native or fill material, liquefied like crazy. Here, this is showing what we call lateral spread. So there's a slope to the ground and you get liquefaction underneath, and the ground just kind of oozes, and then it ruptured through that wall and it went through the corner of the building. Yep.
Do you perform any subsurface exploration while you're out there?
We didn't have time. We're going to be mobilizing that in the next month or two. That takes a lot of money to do that. So we're going to be doing cost sharing with our colleagues in Turkey to try to do investigations of the specific strengths of these soils that liquefied. That's how we then use that data in our forecast models. Here's a point bar, massive liquefaction and lateral spreading. Here is a building that structurally was fine, but it had foundation punching due to liquefaction, and you can see the tilt in that building. So that building's probably not going to be usable. I think that was 5 degrees of tilt. Here's liquefaction that happened at along the highway and a bend, and the whole road just flowed out into the creek. More liquefaction at the ports. Here was liquefaction of gravel. So it doesn't have to be sand, it could be any granular material, and it fluidizes. And then what happens is that you have stress pushing down on it, it's fluidized, and it says, I'm getting out of here, and it ejects out of the ground, and you get these things called sand boils or volcancitos. Here was a carnival area in Eskenderan, liquefaction everywhere. There's a port facility. They didn't intend to park the truck in the water. That's how much displacement happened due to the liquefaction. So the port facilities got hammered really hard. And this is a very busy port area for the country. So I'm going to show you some more images, but I wanted to stop here after we did our initial trips into the area and we came back, and I'm in Ankara, which is the capital, and I'm in these meetings with their FEMA and their dam agencies. And the conversations got weird really quick. And people started coming up with these complex explanations or excuses or going off on these tangents. And I was getting really frustrated, which I do about this stuff. And I said, you know what, this isn't complex. And in statistics, we use this thing called a confusion matrix. And the confusion matrix talks about true positives and true negatives and false positive and false negatives. And it just kept coming into my head. And so I was sitting there in this meeting getting angry, and I thought, you know what? I like the term confusion because it's ironic. It's not confusing. So if we take a situation where you have bad foundation and you have bad structure and you get this pile, that's not acceptable. If you have good structural, but you don't do anything with the foundation, that's not acceptable. That doesn't work. And here, the foundation's fine, but you just completely screwed up on the structure. That's not going to work either. It's pretty simple. There's just two components. You do a good job on the structural design, you do a good job on the foundation. And we saw lots and lots of evidence of structures that performed well. So I've been using this, and this building here, this one even has a soft story. You can see that there's kind of open bays on the first floor, and they cut the geometry a little bit, which is like, don't do that. And then they probably don't have enough shear resistance, but they did a good enough job that it survived really strong ground shaking here. And look at the building next to it and the building behind it, just rubble. So it's not a mystery. There's no mystery here. I have experience looking at performance of dams from a bunch of earthquakes that I went on. And so after I was in the field for a few days, I was tasked with, by the dam agency, to go visit these dams. And they said, we need you to visit this one, this one, this one. They have, in that area, they have 100 some dams, but they had 8 that they wanted us to look at, and they assigned 6 to me. And so the first one is way up north, and it's called the Sultan Suya Dam. And this is why the Army Corps was really interested, is because this is test cases of what they may have to deal with. The Army Corps has 700 dams that are subjected to seismic ground shaking in our country, and some of them are as old as the 20s and 30s. This dam's newer. You can see large crest cracks. I'm circling that for reference. That's the same feature. So now I'm down on the face, really large face cracks. You can see the reservoir is low because right after the earthquake, somebody visited, said, oh crap, and then they drew the reservoir down quickly. We get to the toe, and on the far right, liquefaction. This was not a surprise. Why are dams susceptible to liquefaction? Well, because we put dams in river basins. Rivers carry sediment, and unless you deal with that material, which we didn't really understand liquefaction until starting in the 70s, and most of our dams were built before the 70s, then you have problems with liquefaction. Also, we didn't really understand faulting that much, and now we know that rivers like to follow faults, and so most of our dams are sitting on faults and liquefiable material. The Army Corps is trying to address this, but it's really expensive to fix these things. So that was one dam. I'm going to go through this quickly. Here's another dam. My colleague here is Umut. I've been working in Turkey for years, and I have PhD students here. Umut happened to be, before this, was one of my PhD students. And then we got to spend 6 days together traveling around and looking at dams. Now he is the country's foremost seismic dam expert. He is, honestly. He's seen more seismic dam response than anyone in the whole country. And I said, Umut, you got this. And he's like, yeah, I got this. So crest cracking, large cracks on the face. We get down to the toe, liquefaction. And these dams are about anywhere from 50 to 60 meters high. So these are big earth dams. These are mainly for flood and irrigation. These are not hydro. And all the outlet structures that we observed were fine. So there wasn't issues about not being able to release the water. That's one of the scary ones. You get a dam and it's damaged, and then outlet structures are damaged, and then you can't release the water, and you have villages downstream, and then the dam breaches, and then you have huge life loss. So all these dams were drawn down to what we call low pool. Here's one, crest cracking, outlet structure's fine, and you can see a little bit of tilt to the parapet wall. This is what we call seismic compression. The earthquake takes earth fill and shakes it and says, I can densify better than you can. And so you get a little bit of densification of the material. This one's fine. This dam doesn't need rebuilding like the other two that we saw. This one had rock abutments, earth fill, a little bit of cracking on the superficial cracking on the outlet structure. The ground shaking was intense enough to have lots of rock fall. And I want you to look over on the picture on the right. And that black line, that's the bathtub ring on the dam. That's where the reservoir level is. And if you see in the middle, you can see it's got a little bit of a sway back. Again, this was seismic compression. The biggest part of the earth dam, it settled the most. And so this dam doesn't really need much other than resurfacing of the crest. There wasn't issues with the face on either upstream or downstream. And then this is the Sugu Dam. And I love it when people have white painted lines, right? So you got the displacement there. So this dropped down and it moved towards the upstream face of the dam. And I'm showing these because at every dam, they had these great signs that told you when it was built, how big it is, how much volume it holds. It was awesome. It was just like having the as-built right in front of you. And here you can see that vertical, and it's hard to see, but there was some bulging on the upstream face. This one actually experienced some seismic slope stability. Not as critical as the liquefaction, but this one might need a little bit more work than the two that survived the seismic compression. Questions before I move past dams?
Are you gonna be able to get data from the acquisitions?
Oh, it's unclear right now how much information, if there were piezometers or if they're accelerometers. My colleague that's there, he's working closely with the dam agency to get all the information that they have. And then we're going to build case histories from this. So check back with me in a month on that.
Is there sharing back with like the church?
Yes, we're.
Also with like obviously the learning that we provide.
Yeah, we're working hand in hand with our Turkish colleagues. I'll show my colleagues at the end, but the Turkish colleague that I'm working with, who's running it in country, we did our PhDs together, and we've been working together for 20 plus years. And so when this happened, I knew I had to go, and he knew I had to go, and then we just got together and we just started making it happen. So there's lots of collaboration. Unlike the Japan event in 2011, where the collaboration was not that easy, different societal norms, not as much data sharing. Here, it's a two-way street. You guys might have seen this one in the news. Rather dramatic. The news likes really dramatic things. I had a few hours at the end of one day. Nobody was killed with this. There was no damage to property, but it was really dramatic. And so we were traveling through that region. And so Umut and I said, let's go check this out and figure out what's going on. And people were saying, oh, the fault ruptured through here, or there was karstic terrain and these caverns opened up, or all these fanciful things. And so we got there. This isn't my drone footage, but it's pretty 3D footage. It looks like a mini Grand Canyon. We got there, and here's my picture. I climbed down to the bottom, so the slide happened, and I climbed down to the bottom right near the head where it started, and I was getting down in the cracks to try to figure out what it was sliding on. And one of the key things here is that this isn't the current name of the town, but the ancient name of the town is Village of Big Cracks. You want to check me on that?
I actually don't know about this. I only just found out about.
Okay.
this map.
But that name, Yari Klikoi.
It's not spelled the way it should be, so I can't.
Okay, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
One thing is, I mean, I'm fluent in Turkish and English, but I can't really translate between two languages.
Got it. So we pull up, and I do this everywhere I go, is you talk to the locals. They don't know the science or the engineering, but they know their experiences. And one thing is when you talk to them, you know, this one with all the death, it's really hard, but you talk to an individual person and you empathize with them one-on-one. So we pull into the gas station and I say, Umut, ask this guy what happened. And he says, I lost 17 cousins. This was a typical story. I lost 17, I lost my whole family. I'm the only survivor. Or me and my son are the only survivors out of 25 people or something. And then they start telling you their experience and they're like, oh, I was sleeping and I got thrown out of bed and we ran outside and I heard these crazy noises. And then we thought it was over. And then 9 hours later, it happened again. And then there's aftershocks. So the aftershocks are almost more destabilizing than the main event. People survive the main event. And then the second one happened. They're like, and then they say, okay, we made it. And then you have these aftershocks and it destroys people's psyche. And when we were there, aftershocks all the time, 5s, 6s, 4s, nonstop. And society just shuts down at that point. Everybody's like, we're done. We can't deal with this anymore. We get to this town and we start talking to the locals and they say, yeah, this used to be called the Village of Big Cracks. This is the ancient name. And it's a really big slide. And I got down there and the other information they gave us is that it had been raining for 2 days really hard before the event. And geologically, this one ended up being kind of a no-brainer. There was a clay stone at the bottom. I found it fully remolded. And so it was just like clay. And you had a wetted clay. And then you had the earthquake kick. And the slope at the toe here was about 20 degrees. And we would call this a retrogressive failure. So the toe blew out and then the next block blew out and next. And so you can see that there's these rafts of olive trees that just work their way down slope. So this one was kind of a nice gee whiz thing to do amidst all the destruction. So it was a good thing to do at the end of one day. And I did some rough calcs and we're doing some more sophisticated calcs with that. Okay. So a few things as we round this out. One of the things that I didn't show is that the road transportation systems performed brilliantly. It was shocking how good the roads and the bridges and the tunnels performed compared to the structural design. Their DOT is doing the best job. I mean, it was amazing. Strong ground shaking, fault ruptured through the highways everywhere, and the road embankments were fine. They would just go out there with a digger and they would fill it in and boom, you were back in business. So transportation-wise, top-notch. Huge viaducts survived. Tunnels with the fault ruptured through survived. Transportation infrastructure was great. Liquefaction was shocking how much there was. And I show Adapazari because Adapazari was an event that happened in '99. And this region, big city, got hammered by liquefaction. This is up near Istanbul, near the northern Anatolian Fault. Got hammered. And it was a wake-up call. It was like, hey, we need to do better about this. Here, this event was 10 times Adapazari. We saw 10, 12 cities, the scale of Adapazari where liquefaction was widespread and resulted in foundation failure of buildings. I showed you fault rupture everywhere. 450 kilometers worth of fault rupture. It was shocking how much. And then certain towns had both fault rupture and liquefaction. The town of Gobayashi, the fault ruptured right through there, and you had liquefaction, lateral spreading. It was just like, it was crazy seeing all this stuff. Strong ground motion effects, we have everything. Like I said, this is so heavily instrumented. We're going to get so much data from this. And right now we have a team in Turkey and a team in the US, and they're processing these motions. And there's a lot of details in processing the motions, but they're going to be ready in about a week. The thing that's really hard to stomach is that the lack of enforcing building codes resulted in the life loss. And there's just, I mean, that's just it. That's just the whole story when it comes to this life loss. I've seen events similar, ground shaking similar, Chile 2010, 300 lives lost. The damage area is about the same, infrastructure is about the same, but they follow building codes, and those lives were lost mainly due to tsunami. You can't, designing against tsunami is really hard. Tohoku, Japan, 2011, very large damage zone like this. And we're talking about hundreds of life lost. And again, that was tsunami. Structures can survive this. This was a man-made disaster. And this, if you're watching the news, is what's playing out in Turkey right now. They're in a recession. They're in a drought. They're in a political cycle right now where the election's coming up. And there's lots of evidence that the current administration is culpable for allowing people to build without adhering to the building codes. There's an amnesty program, and the amnesty program happens right before the election, and they say, hey, your building's not designed right, but if you give us this money, then we'll just write this thing off and say that you're okay.
I think one thing you mentioned when you were interviewing with the Turkish counterpart was the frustration. Largely that finger blaming has to do with the fact that they don't want to go to prison because people are going to get held responsible for poor building design, and they get locked up for it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, right now, what happens in these situations is there's a lot of scapegoating. And so they've rounded up on the order of 250 contractors, and they say, you guys are all bad, and we're going to put you in jail and try you. But that doesn't deal with the problem. That's not addressing the problem. And then like the embankment dam stuff is going to be really one of the big outcomes for the U.S. Army Corps', waited with bated breath for us to come up with these case histories. I'm going to skip this. This is for a presentation next week, but these are the tools that we use to collect the data. And I want to get to a different slide. Really, it's having your eyes and it's observing. That's the key, is going there and observing things and documenting things, understanding the physics, and figuring out how to translate what the physics is telling you.
You skip this. So curious what you did for food driving.
You don't eat a lot. So we didn't know if we were going to have, we brought sleeping bags because we didn't know if we were going to have to sleep in the cars or not. My colleagues, right before I arrived, were sleeping in cars. We packed the car full of water and emergency food. It's really intense, so you're not that hungry. And then at the beginning and end of the day, you hope to find someplace. I showed you the town early on. It's called Antep or Gaziantep, and that town had some damage. But right before the day we were driving through there, we heard reports that it was kind of functioning. And Umut had a cousin who ran a hotel, and he called his cousin and he said, hey, can we use your hotel? And he says, no, we're closed. And he said, please, please, please. And so he opened the hotel just for us, and they didn't have the heat on or anything, but we had a place to stay. And then all the kebab places were operating because everybody needed food, because if they're, the grocery stores. And so we had kebab and we had baklava. We had tons of kebab and baklava. All the street vendors were fully functioning. But, we also carried bags of food to hand out to locals. So we'd pull into some crazy town and we would hand out candy and food to the kids and whoever we saw. So we'd bring food and hand it out because supplies were limited. We made sure that the gas stations were working before we struck off into that area. That was key, right? If we're driving around, we need to make sure there's gas. Any questions on the recon before I want to get to one particular slide at the end. Okay. So I saw this in Nepal. Nepal has great building codes, no enforcement. Thousands of people dead. In Nepal, they do this thing, and you say, doesn't this worry you? And they do this thing in their head, and they're like, that's the way it is. This is how life is. And I have trouble with that. Turkey, right now, there's a lot of civil unrest. People are angry about this and not necessarily accepting. But how do we protect people when codes are not enforced on their behalf, right? How do we deal with this? And when I come away from events like this, it's almost hopeless, right? Because you try to change the system, and I'm sitting in these meetings and people were defending it, like, oh, it's this thing, like the steel, maybe the steel came from this manufacturer, or they used the wrong aggregate in the concrete. And they're focusing on these little niggly details when it's the big picture. It's this corrupt system. And I don't want to use corruption lightly. It's, I don't think there's malice that's intended. I just think that there's selfishness and greed, and we're all susceptible to that. But it's become systemic, and in certain countries, it becomes systemic in how they build things. And so when Nepal happened, and we came back from Nepal, and I was working with my students, and we're struggling. We're like, how do we deal with this? And so we had a couple ideas that we started mobilizing after Nepal, and we got some traction. We didn't get as far as we want, and I think we're going to get more traction this time. Is how do we protect these people? You can't trust the adults. I think that one potential solution is you train middle schoolers. They've had earth science, they understand earthquakes, and then you teach them about shear resistance in buildings, and you teach them about good foundation design, and then it becomes intuitive. And it's like recycling. When I was a kid, we were trained on recycling, and my parents, right, they don't understand it. And they threw a glass bottle in the garden, and you're like, oh, right? It's like that. That's what I want. I want that. They go to a building and they want to rent the apartment, and they know enough to ask, well, does this shear wall have enough steel? And what did you do? I want to see, the foundation design, like just something that's intuitive. Can we train the next generation? It's going to take 10 years, but can we train the next generation so that we don't have to make the adults do what they're supposed to? The adults are not protecting these kids. Can we train them? And so there's a lot of traction right now. We have a lot of contacts in country. We're talking to the educational minister. We're talking to people that set the curriculum, and we're trying to get more traction this time. Should we attack it with apps and games? Should we design a game that becomes viral and it's fun, and you have to add shear resistance into the buildings, and you got to put piles when there's liquefiable soil, and you have to avoid faults, and when you do that, you win, right? I don't know. What I'm looking for is some way to get past this issue of non-enforcement, because we can't change that. We tried in Nepal, and then it just got mired in all this weird politics and weird human nature. And can we try to have this effect in Turkey? So I'm going to do all the engineering science that I do, but this is something that I feel passionate about, and I think that it's worth the effort. And I want anybody that has any ideas or any ways to gain traction on this to jump in. I don't want to own this. I want this to be some type of movement.
Do they have any type of ongoing inspection there, to where, why would they build this building and do all the corruption if they know that every year, every 2 years, an inspection would happen, inspect the foundation, and
Nope. This is amnesty program where you built it bad. Okay, here's your certificate.
There's something that I do want to mention though about that. In particular, in Istanbul, when I visited it back in 2021 and back in this summer in 2022, what I was seeing in one of the districts where my grandmother lives along with my cousin is that a lot of the older buildings are actually getting demolished and new ones are being put up in their place, simply because that section of the city is built on some poor soil and was hit very hard during the 1999 earthquake. So there is some progress, but I can't speak for every other region of the country.
One of the more disheartening things is that you would come to a block, and we would always have locals with us asking them, you come to a block and you say, destroyed. This building looks good. Tell us about that one. Oh, the owner lives there. Destroyed. What about this one? Yeah, the owner lives in that one too. Now, this is anecdotal and it isn't systematic, but every time we went into, we would say, why is this one so good? And they're like, because it's the owner's building and they live there. So
So, to find some of the silver linings in the transportation infrastructure.
Yes.
The resiliencies that talked about this before, but that likely had a source of funding that required inspection to construct it. So whether that money came from the World Bank
Right.
or the UN or wherever it may have come from,
There was some outside leverage.
there was some protocols there
Yeah.
that require that inspection. That is why that infrastructure is, and so.
Yeah.
But when it's, either a private development or, somebody wants to invest in a storefront in an apartment, those protocols.
They're not gonna live on large scale budgets.
Are there existing groups, specifically funding this into, like the community members?
Yes, it's unclear how much impact they're going to have. There are local groups, and I saw some really good news stories about local groups that are doing it right on a community by community basis. So that's within country, and then coming from outside of the country, there's a group called Build Change, and Build Change, what they do is they go into disaster-stricken places like this, and they study the local architecture and design, and then they come up with appropriate designs that are also seismic resistant. And so Build Change is going to be in country next month to start this process. And I'm not showing it here, but there's really good evidence of 200-300-year-old buildings where they use these timber shear reinforcement, and then it's brick and fill, and those things perform great. So there's historic evidence of people doing good seismic design. It's the modern construction that really sucks.
How about the banking system? If I go get a loan and the bank's not going to give me a loan.
They do.
So
And the insurance system is culpable as well. So they don't have insurance based on hazard. It's just like a blanket insurance. You got a building, this is how much you pay. So there isn't that, there isn't the teeth in the process. We have lots of teeth in our process. Like you do this wrong and you can end up in jail, or, the insurance comes in and they say, this is a claptrap, we're not going to insure this. That process isn't functioning.
Protect their investment.
No, not right now. And there's talk about reforming the insurance business in Turkey. We'll see how far that goes.
Other than the research team, who directly from Turkey will see this data?
Yeah, okay. So this character. This is my colleague Under. We've been working together for 24 years. He is a professor at METU, the Middle Eastern Technical University, and he's kind of a big heavy in the country. And so we're working together on this. And then there is the advanced team, and you can see I'm the only gringo there. There's Umut on the right. Osgur lives in the US. He's in the back corner with the hat on. He lives in the US. He's a tectonic geologist and a paleoseismologist, but he traveled with me. And then Erhan is in the left corner there, and he's a local geologist. And so this was it. This was the advanced team, the four of us. And then while we were out in the field, Ander went out in the field with us. And then this is national news. He's sitting on national news. There's Ander. There's the head of the Contractors Association. And then there's a psychologist. And then there's just some goofy reporter there. And this was a 3-hour program. And it was a total circus. And Ander kept trying to get to the basics and explain what was going on. And then the contractor's like, hey, why are you guys blaming me? Blah, blah, blah. Honestly, at the end of the program, he started selling a new development. It was shocking. It was shocking. So Ander is the champion in country, but there's lots of Turkish researchers there that know what they're doing. They have excellent seismic training. We're only helping them. They're fully functional, and we're helping them deal with stuff that is outside of the scope, or is too big, or we can fund, or we can get the equipment. So right now we're trying to fund flying a drone over the whole fault and doing what's called structure for motion, so we can map the whole fault. And we're trying to fund subsurface investigations, and we're trying to fund a subsequent team to do paleoseismology and then aid them in subsequent research. So that was advanced team. This is team A. They're the ones that went after us and just came back. So you can see that there's a number of people who are Turkish but live in the US. There's Onder and a bunch of his grad students, and then Menzer Pelvin on the left. She's a researcher here in the US that went there, and David Frost is from Georgia Tech. Southwest Research Institute. So our group has a good mix of people that have experience, that don't have experience, in-country context, no in-country context, expertise in various areas, and we try to tackle it from all angles. I think, yeah, there's the full team there. And then just a nice thing at the end is my colleague, maybe you guys have the new iPhone, it has LiDAR on it. This is a sand boil floating in space that he shot with his iPhone. I'm not a big Apple fan. I mean, I got an Apple computer, but wow, you can do LiDAR on your phone. Yeah. So I'm happy, and let's have further discussions. But what I really wanted is I wanted a dialogue, and I really appreciate you guys being here and participating. And I don't want to be a talking head. I want to disseminate these ideas, and I want to continue this discussion. So that's it for my presentation. And I'm happy to entertain any further questions. Yeah, Ed.
How about other materials, timber, steel, did you see other materiality?
This is a Mediterranean region. There's not a lot of timber available. The Taurus Mountains are not heavily forested mountains. And there was not a lot of steel construction. It was all just reinforced concrete. Yeah, and brick infill. Amaya.
I was gonna ask, I'm a qualitative researcher by training, and so I was really curious to understand like how you have like kind of the resources when you go into these regions and how you use like kind of the context that you can gather from the people that are there to better understand and inform. Like you've touched on some things, but it's like really interesting to see how that helps shape like where you go.
Top to bottom. So we're in touch with all the agencies that are willing to work with us. So the dam agencies, the transportation agencies, their FEMA, everybody. Sometimes they're willing to share, sometimes not, but oftentimes they're willing to utilize their expertise. And so like the dam agency said, you're here, we want you to go visit these dams because you know what you're looking at. And so happy to render that expertise. And then all the way down from utilizing researchers and graduate students in country to talking to as many locals as we can, because all of that is really useful information. And then you just assimilate it all and form a story, right? I mean, it's really about storytelling. Yeah.
So I know, and you mentioned some also about like civil unrest, about sort of anger towards what this happened, and clips that have been being played is from like the 2019 election cycle, the current Turkish president bragging about the scale of residential construction that was taking place majorly in cities that were hardest hit by this due to amnesty programs that were allowing for people to sort of pay to bypass codes. So I guess, is there any hope that you have, or that your colleagues have, that pressure might come from the reverse now, like people demanding more from their politicians?
One would hope so. One would hope so. To me, it feels like that Turkey is really at a crux